a lot of major confusion about how we who are children of God are to understand the teachings of Jesus Christ in Matthew, the fifth chapter, verses 19 and beyond. It seems that the Lord's words are even paradoxical. They contradict reason and rationality, and that what he was doing seems to be presenting a religion of goody feelings, and I am so wonderful that I can't have friends or enemies, that it is confusing to most people who study them. Jesus had just taught of blessedness in Matthew, the fifth chapter, that even the Jews had trouble with understanding, because there was nothing in the law of Moses that was its like or its equal, and it definitely had not been realized. The teaching of the law and the prophets up until his time had shown a stern religion of vengeance and anger. And when Christ came, of course, it was the one thing that people wanted to understand. How is it that God would feel? The honor of attaching the practice of being obedient as God would command was not something that was taught under the Old Testament law. It taught an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And when Christ came, he came to set the record straight. The disciples may have been willing, but they may not have also been strong enough to put these principles into practice. And therefore, it was up to the Lord to teach how he intended for man to live. Jesus begins in Matthew, the fifth chapter, the 19th verse. Whosoever there shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, the problem with all this is that some people don't know what law to follow. We'll be developing this theme in the next 2 or 3 sessions if you'll join us. But let's first start off with trying to find out what law we're to follow. I was teaching a man the scriptures the other day, and he happened to be one who spoke another language different than I, but he could communicate in his ability in my language so that we could study together. And he asked me the question. He said, what does your Bible say in certain verse? Happened to be Leviticus, the second chapter. So I turned to Leviticus, the second chapter, and read him the Old Testament that I have, and the one that's in the King James Bible. I have many other translations, but just for convenience sake, to the King James. And he says, well, mine says the same thing. He seemed to be surprised, because what he was talking about was how a priest was to be presented a sacrifice, and that sacrifice was to be a lamb. He then had me read further and went on to explain the fact that, as we read, that was to be involved in keeping the Sabbath day. And he said, what does your Bible say then? And I said, well, it says the same thing. Well, then he says, do you keep the Sabbath? I said, absolutely not. He said, why? You're supposed to be following the Bible. I said, do you not understand that when Jesus came to the world, he nailed the Old Testament covenant to the cross? Amongst the ancients, when a covenant was broken, there was a nail driven in the covenant, which busted or splintered it and caused everybody to know that it was no longer binding. So in Colossians 2:14, Jesus nailed the covenant. Paul, writing to the brethren at Colossae, said that he blotted out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, taking it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. I asked the man a question. I said, can you find me a Levitical priest? He said, I wouldn't know where to go to find one. Well, I said, frankly, neither would I. Can you answer me another question? Have you ever offered a four-legged lamb? No, he said, I never have. I said, well, neither have I. He said, what's your point? I said, do you not understand that this was a law and a covenant that you and I have never been obligated by God to obey? We have a New Testament covenant. This is the new law of Christ. And I cited him the book of Hebrews, the 8th chapter. And if you've not had a chance to read it, you should go to Hebrews 8 and begin with verse 8 and go through verse 13. When God says, a new law I will make with the house of Israel, not like the law that I made with them when I took them by the hand and led them by the sea. I will bring about a new law, and I will write it in their hearts. And when they have obeyed that law, I shall be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. Now the Levitical priesthood, the offering of animal sacrifices, the keeping of the Sabbath day, the going of Jerusalem or to Jerusalem to worship 3 times a year, the not being able to go or walk over a quarter of a mile on the Sabbath. All of these commandments that were a part of the Old Testament covenant, Jesus nailed to his cross. He broke them. Paul continues in Colossians 2:16, says, let no man therefore judge you or know you in meat or drinks or holy days or of the Sabbath. For the law of Moses, the 10 Commandments as most people refer to them, was something that was to the Jew who was of the ancestry of Abraham, that began about 1,500 years before Christ brought his new covenant into the world. But when Christ came to the world and resurrected from the dead, he came to his disciples and he said, all authority hath now been given unto me in heaven and on earth. Go ye therefore and teach all nations what I'm going to have you teach. In Mark 16, verse 15, he says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be damned. Now that would have been the very ideal place for Jesus to teach, he that believes and keeps the Sabbath shall be saved. Or he that believeth and goes to a Levitical priest to offer sacrifices for sins shall be saved. Or he that doesn't walk a quarter of a mile on the Sabbath day shall stay in fellowship and be saved. But no, what Jesus taught and Jesus commanded was a new law. A new law, he says. Now, he gives many examples in his teachings while he was here on the earth about not trying to put new wine in old bottles or put a new patch over an old wineskin. He said the law of Christ is not some revamping of the law of Moses. It is completely new. Jesus said in Revelation 21, behold, I make all things new. This new means something that is contradictory and different to that has been. Paul would write that the Old Testament law is fading away. It will no longer be something that anybody would keep. You couldn't, to save your life, keep the Old Testament covenant law today. You couldn't find a Levitical priesthood. Nobody could trace their ancestry back to Levi. It would do you no good to offer a four-legged lamb, for the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer and the blood of a pure ram, if you please, a lamb, could not ever forgive sin. At best, under the Old Testament covenant, it only could roll them ahead. And the keeping of the Sabbath day was never anything to anyone but they who came out of Egypt. In Deuteronomy, the 5th chapter, Moses stands before the children of Israel and talks about the law that God gave to those who came out of Egypt. I've never been to Egypt. Don't know what it would be like there. You possibly have not either. And if you're not, then the Ten Commandments, as they call them, which really is a 15th or 16th century coined phrase. It's not in the original Hebrew, but the Ten Commandments, which really translated are the 10 words of Moses, was never a part of the New Testament covenant. So we have to know which covenant we're going to keep, which one we're going to obey. But because the Jews, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, had so maligned the plan of God and taught these Jews the lack of love that the law of Moses espoused, when Jesus came and taught them the heart of God, it seems to be contradictory, paradoxical. And the Christian today finds it something hard to understand when he reads, "For I say unto you, he that needs to borrow money, loan it to him." Because he knows somebody's going to take advantage of him in a big hurry. We'll continue this study if you'll stay with us.